They said her choice was simple: marry the vile Lord Belcourt and save her family from ruin or be cast into the abyss. But Lady Seraphina Cavendish, whose mind lived among the stars and in the pages of books, chose a third option. She ran. A dark alley, the flash of a blade, a tall, grim stranger in a soldier's coat, a hasty, desperate vow made over a blacksmith's anvil. She thought she was marrying a poor, honourable soldier to be free. She had no idea she had just bound herself to the most powerful man in Scotland. The ballroom at Cavendish House glittered, but it was the cold glitter of frost on a tomb. It was the third ball in a fortnight, each more lavish, more desperate than the last. Lady Seraphina Cavendish stood near the French doors, the suffocating scent of lilies and beeswax making her temples throb. She watched the dancers, a blur of pastel silks and powdered wigs, with the detached curiosity of a naturalist observing a particularly frantic species of insect. They were all performing, all of them trapped in this stifling, glittering box. Her father, Lord Cavendish, was smiling. It was a brittle, terrifying smile, stretched thin over the face of a man dangling from a precipice. He was smiling at Lord Belcourt. Belcourt. Seraphina's stomach turned. He was a man made of damp, soft flesh, with small, calculating eyes that seemed to strip everyone of their dignity. He was old enough to be her grandfather, smelled of stale snuff and brandy, and held the Cavendish family's debts in his pudgy, ring-covered fist. And he wanted her as his payment. "My dear Lady Seraphina," Belcourt's voice, wet and intimate, slid into her ear. He hadn't bothered to approach her properly. He simply materialized at her elbow. "You are looking particularly luminous tonight, like a pearl, waiting to be plucked." She stiffened, her gaze remaining fixed on the gardens outside. "You flatter me, Lord Belcourt, though I believe pearls are best left in their shells." His chuckle was a low rumble. "Nonsense. They are meant to be worn, to be shown off. Your father and I have just concluded our arrangement. The engagement will be announced in the Morning Post on Friday." Ice flooded her veins. She turned to him, her facade of polite indifference cracking. "Arrangement? I have agreed to no such thing." "You will," Belcourt said, his smile vanishing, replaced by the flat, dead-eyed certainty of a predator. "Your father's finances are, shall we say, irretrievable. I am his only salvation. And you, my dear, are mine." He took a pinch of snuff, dusting the brown powder from his elaborate waistcoat. "You are an intelligent woman, Lady Seraphina. Do not mistake this for a negotiation. It is a statement of fact." He bowed, a mockery of courtesy, and moved away to gloat with her father. Seraphina felt the room tilt. She could see her future laid out like a corpse, a life tethered to that vile man, her mind, which loved astronomy, philosophy, and the clean logic of mathematics, left to atrophy in a house filled with his vulgar collections. She would not do it. She would rather scrub floors. She would rather starve. Later that night, the house was silent. The last of the carriages had rumbled away, leaving only the scent of guttering candles. In her room, Seraphina pulled a heavy, leather-bound copy of Newton's Principia from her shelf. Behind it, a small alcove held her secret, a canvas satchel, a small, heavy purse of coins saved from her pin money, and a single, perfect pearl necklace, her grandmother's. It was the only thing of real value she possessed that Belcourt couldn't claim. A soft knock came at the door. It was Isabel, her lady's maid, and the only person in this house she trusted. Isabel's face was pale. "He's given the order, my lady," Isabel whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. "Lord Belcourt, He's sending his own men to guard this house tomorrow. He called you skittish. He said you are not to leave this room without his permission, even before the wedding." The breath left Seraphina's lungs. Tomorrow. She had thought she had days. Now she had only hours. "Isabel," Seraphina said, her voice shaking but hardening with resolve. "Do you remember the route to the old tenant's gate?" "My lady, you can't. It's past midnight. The streets." "The streets are less dangerous than that man," Seraphina said, pulling the satchel from the wall. She thrust the pearl necklace into Isabel's hand. "This is for you, for your silence, and for your loyalty." I can't," Isabel stammered, tears welling. "You must. Go to your cousins in Kent. Be gone before dawn. He will be furious when he finds me gone, and he will punish anyone who he thinks helped me." She changed out of her fine muslin nightgown and into her plainest, sturdiest travelling dress, a dark wool the colour of shadows. She bundled her hair under a simple bonnet. She was no longer Lady Seraphina Cavendish, heiress to a crumbling legacy. She was just a woman running for her life. She gripped the satchel. "Wish me luck, Isabel." "Godspeed, my lady," Isabel wept, clutching the pearls. Seraphina didn't look back. She slipped down the servants' staircase, the cold stone biting through her thin slippers. She bypassed the main hall, where a footman dozed fitfully in a chair, and moved through the kitchens, dark and smelling of yeast and cold ashes. The tenant's gate was at the far end of the sodden, neglected garden. It was stiff, the iron hinges groaning in protest. Seraphina winced, easing it open just wide enough to slip through. She closed it with a soft, final click. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of a cage door closing, but she was on the outside. She stepped out into the alley. The cold, damp air of London hit her, thick with the smell of the river, coal smoke, and gin. The gas lamps cast feeble pools of yellow light, swallowed by the oppressive darkness of Cheapside. She was free, and she was terrified. She clutched her small purse, her knuckles white, and began to run. She had no destination, only a direction. Away. North. As far north as the coaches would take her. The respectable streets of Mayfair quickly gave way to the labyrinthine squalor of the city's underbelly. The transition was jarring. Here, the air was not just damp, it was foul. Seraphina pulled her cloak tighter, her bonnet hiding her face, but she knew she stood out. Her posture, her gait, the very fabric of her wool dress, though plain, screamed quality. She had been walking for what felt like hours, trying to find the main coaching inn, the Swan with two necks, from which the northern mail coaches departed. But the streets twisted and turned, and the fog rolling in from the Thames conspired with the darkness to confuse her. She turned a corner into a narrow close, little more than a slit between two towering, crumbling tenements. Gin-soaked laughter echoed from a doorway. She pressed on, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Well, well, what are we here?" A man stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. He was large, unshaven, and smelled powerfully of cheap rum. A second man, slighter but with quick, darting eyes, emerged behind her. She was trapped. A pretty little bird lost from her nest. The first man grinned, revealing a row of broken brown teeth. "And carrying a heavy purse, I'll wager." "Please," Seraphina said, her voice coming out as a breathless squeak. "I have no money. I am just a governess, late for my position." "A governess?" the second man cackled. "With hands like that? Soft as milk." He lunged and grabbed her satchel. Seraphina cried out, holding on with all her strength. The first man grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a vice. "Be a good girl and give it over," he snarled, raising his other hand. "I think the lady would prefer to keep her belongings." The voice was new. It was deep, calm, and carried a strange, rolling burr. It came from the mouth of the alley. All three of them turned. A man stood there, silhouetted against the weak light of the street. He was tall, very tall, and broad-shouldered. He wore a worn, dark wool coat, high boots, and what looked like the remnants of a soldier's uniform, not a pristine red coat, but the rough, practical kit of a man who had seen service. His hair was dark and unbound, and his face was all hard angles and shadow. The ruffian holding Seraphina sneered. "And who are you? A protector? Piss off, soldier boy, afore you get hurt." The soldier took one step forward into the light. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, and that was somehow more frightening. "Let her go," he said. It was not a request. The second man, the smaller one, let go of the satchel and pulled a knife. "I'll gut ya." The soldier moved. It was not the flurry of a tavern brawler. It was a precise, brutal economy of motion. He parried the knife thrust, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting. There was a sickening snap of bone, and the man screamed, clutching his arm. The soldier didn't pause. He struck the larger man, who was still holding Seraphina, with a single, devastating punch to the solar plexus. The man folded like a piece of paper, releasing her and collapsing to the cobblestones, gasping like a landed fish. It was over in 3 seconds. Seraphina stumbled back against the damp brick wall, hyperventilating. The small man was already scrambling away, cradling his broken wrist. The large one was unmoving. The soldier turned to her. His eyes, now visible in the gloom, were a startling, clear grey. They held no triumph, only a weary assessment. "Are you harmed, mistress?" he asked. His accent was thick. Highland, she thought. No, thank you, sir. You saved me." He nodded, glancing at the man on the ground, who was beginning to groan. "He'll wake with a sore head." He then looked back at her, his gaze sharp and suspicious. "The man was right about one thing. You're no governess. What is a lady of quality doing in 7 Dials at 3 in the morning?" Seraphina's mind raced. She couldn't tell him the truth. He might return her for the reward. She had no doubt her father would post one by morning. My family. I am fleeing a cruel guardian," she lied, the words tasting like ash. "He is forcing me into a marriage I cannot bear. I am trying to reach the coaching inn, to find passage north to relatives in York." The soldier watched her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing her words, searching her face for the truth. His own face was strong, lean and weathered, as if he had spent most of his life outdoors. He looked to be around 30, and there was a deep sadness in his eyes that warred with his obvious strength. "The Swan is another mile from here. You'll not make it alone," he said flatly. He gestured to the fallen ruffian. "There are more of his kind between here and there." "Then, could you?" she began. I'll see you to the inn," he said, as if it were an inconvenience he had already resigned himself to. "Stay close." He didn't offer her his arm. He simply turned and began to walk, his long strides forcing her to almost jog to keep up. He walked with a purpose, his head on a swivel, a protector, not a companion. "What is your name?" she asked, hurrying beside him. "Ewan MacLeod," he replied, without looking at her. "I am Sarah Price." He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. They walked in silence for several minutes, the thud of his heavy boots on the stones, the only sound besides their breathing. He navigated the dark streets with an unerring confidence. "Are you from London, Mr. MacLeod?" she asked, trying to fill the tense silence. "No," he said. I've been stationed here. My regiment was disbanded. I'm returning home. Home? Is that north? Aye. Scotland. His voice was curt, clipped, discouraging further questions. But Seraphina was intrigued. This man was a puzzle. He fought like a demon but spoke with a grim courtesy. He was a common soldier, yet he possessed an aura of command she had seen in few generals. They reached the bustling yard of the Swan with two necks. It was a hive of activity, even at this hour. Coaches were being loaded, horses hitched, passengers shouting. The air smelled of hay, hot metal, and unwashed bodies. "This is it," MacLeod said, stopping at the edge of the torchlit yard. "Thank you, Mr. MacLeod. You have truly... I am in your debt." She fumbled with her purse. "Please, let me offer you something for your trouble." "I don't take money for helping folk," he said, his voice rough. He looked at her again, his grey eyes softening for just a fraction of a second. "You'd best find your coach, Mistress Price, and be more careful who you trust." He nodded once, a curt, soldierly gesture, and then turned. Before she could say another word, he had vanished, swallowed by the London fog and the pre-dawn crowds. Seraphina stood alone, clutching her satchel, the phantom grip of the ruffian on her arm already being replaced by the memory of the stranger's quiet, devastating power. Seraphina quickly learned that freedom was a harsh commodity. She paid a premium for a ticket on the next coach leaving for the north, a lumbering beast called the North Star, which was not scheduled to depart until dawn. The only available seat was on the outside, exposed to the elements. She found a dark, cold corner in the waiting room, a fuggy, crowded space filled with snoring merchants and crying children. She huddled on a bench, her satchel on her lap, every nerve screaming with exhaustion. Sleep was impossible. As the first grey, watery light of dawn seeped into the yard, a figure entered the waiting room, shaking the rain from his coat. It was Ewan MacLeod. Seraphina's heart leapt. He was carrying his own small roll. He too was a passenger. He scanned the room, and his eyes found hers. The briefest flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by his usual grim mask. He gave a stiff nod and moved to the other side of the room, clearly intending to keep his distance. A sudden, terrifying noise from the street outside shattered the room's drowsy stupor. A man in her father's livery was shouting, holding up a piece of paper. "Reward, 50 guineas for information. Missing Lady Seraphina Cavendish. 18 years of age, dark hair, blue eyes. Fled her home. She is to be returned, unharmed." Seraphina's blood turned to ice. 50 guineas. It was a fortune, enough to make any one of the tired poor people in this room turn her in without a second thought. She shrank back, pulling her bonnet so low it covered her face entirely. She saw a man nudge his wife, looking around the room speculatively. She saw Ewan MacLeod's head snap up. He looked at the man in livery, then his gaze shot directly to her. He knew. "Lady Seraphina," he mouthed, his expression darkening. She was trapped. They would find her before the coach ever left the yard. The coach horn blared, "All aboard for York, Durham, and Newcastle." In a moment of pure, unadulterated panic, Seraphina bolted. She grabbed her bag, ran from the waiting room, and collided directly with MacLeod, who was standing just outside the door. He grabbed her arms to steady her. "They're looking for you," he stated. "Please," she begged, her voice frantic. "You can't let them take me. He will... The man I am being forced to marry. He is a monster. Please, I'll give you anything. I told you, I don't want your money," he said, his voice low and urgent. He was shielding her from the yard with his broad back. "Then what? What do you want?" He looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face with a new, intense scrutiny. He saw no artifice, only raw, primal fear. "Get on the coach," he said abruptly. "But they'll find me. A single woman. They'll stop the coach at the first checkpoint and ask for my papers." "Then you won't be a single woman," he said. Seraphina stared at him. "What? What do you mean?" "I am travelling to Scotland. You say you are travelling north. A soldier and his wife. They won't look twice at us." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. You are proposing." "I am proposing a solution, my lady," he said, his voice sharp. "Not a romance. You need a protector. You need a name. I can give you both until you are safe." "But marriage?" "There's a place, north of the border. Gretna Green. We can be there in 2 days. A blacksmith, an anvil, 2 witnesses. It's fast, and it's binding in Scotland and England both." It was madness, utter, sheer madness. Marry a man she had met only hours ago, a poor, disbanded soldier with a grim face and a sad past. She looked over his shoulder. The man in her father's livery was now conferring with 2 constables, pointing toward the waiting room. They were searching. Lord Belcourt's reach was long. She looked back at Ewan MacLeod. He was offering her an escape. A different kind of cage, perhaps, but one of her own choosing, and his eyes, for all their hardness, seemed honourable. He had rescued her once. He had refused her money. And after," she whispered, "when I am safe?" "Then we are 2 strangers again," he said. "You go your way, I go mine. A simple annulment. No one is harmed." "In name only," she stated, her heart hammering. "In name only," he agreed, his gaze unflinching. "All aboard," the driver roared, impatient. It was the most important decision of her life, and she had less than a second to make it. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I agree." "Right," he said, his face giving nothing away. He grabbed her satchel with one hand and her arm with the other. "This way, and for God's sake, stop looking like a frightened deer. You are Mrs. MacLeod now. Try to look annoyed." He half-dragged her to the coach, shouldering past the other passengers. He spoke to the driver. "My wife and I, we're on the roster. MacLeod, and she'll take my inside seat. I'll ride up top." The driver grunted, checking his list. "Aye, MacLeod, 1 seat, the ladies extra." Ewan pressed several coins into his hand. "She's not feeling well. She needs the inside seat." The driver pocketed the money. "As you wish." Ewan bodily lifted her into the cramped, musty-smelling coach, tossing her satchel in after her. She squeezed onto the bench between a portly woman and a thin-faced preacher. Through the small, grimy window, she saw the constables enter the yard. They were walking toward the coach. Her breath hitched. Ewan MacLeod swung himself up onto the roof, directly above her. He looked down at the constables, his face a mask of bored indifference. One of the constables squinted up at him. "You, soldier, did you see a young lady pass this way? Dark hair, finely dressed, looks lost?" Seraphina held her breath. The coach lurched as the driver took his seat. MacLeod spat onto the cobblestones, narrowly missing the constable's boot. "I've seen 50 women like that, mate. Half of them lost, the other half selling." The constable recoiled in disgust. "Mind your tongue, you dog." "Mind your own business," MacLeod retorted. "We're late." The horn blew. The whip cracked. The coach groaned and lurched forward, throwing Seraphina against the portly woman. It rumbled out of the yard, past the constables, and into the main thoroughfare. They were out. She was out. She leaned her head back against the hard, vibrating wall of the coach, her entire body shaking in reaction. She was safe from Lord Belcourt. But she had just promised to marry a complete stranger. A man who was, at this very moment, sitting on the roof in the pouring rain, having just saved her life for the second time. The journey was a blur of misery. The coach was cramped, cold, and smelled of wet wool and unwashed bodies. They rattled over broken roads for 16 hours a day, stopping only to change horses or for passengers to bolt down a miserable meal of stale bread and thin ale at some god-forsaken inn. At every stop, Ewan would appear at the door, his face streaked with mud and rain, his coat soaked through. He never complained. He would simply hand her a piece of bread or a canteen of water, his large hand brushing hers in the brief, impersonal transaction. "Are you well?" he would ask. "I am," she would reply. "And you? You must be freezing." "I've slept in worse," he'd say, and then he'd be gone, back to his exposed perch on the roof. The other passengers, the preacher, the merchant's wife, a young solicitor, treated her with a detached politeness. She was, as far as they were concerned, a soldier's wife, and thus beneath their station, but the presence of her husband, however rough, prevented any unwelcome advances. She played the part, keeping her eyes downcast, her speech plain. The true test came at night. Their arrangement dictated that they were husband and wife. At the inns they were given a single room. The first night, at a ramshackle place called the Fox and Hounds, Seraphina's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. The room was tiny, with a low, beamed ceiling and a single, lumpy bed. Ewan entered, shut the door, and for the first time, they were truly alone. The air crackled with tension. "You take the bed, my lady," he said, not looking at her. He dropped his roll by the door and unlaced his wet boots. "Seraphina," she said, her voice quiet. "If we are to be this, you must call me Seraphina, and I cannot take the only bed. You are soaked to the bone." "I'll not have you sleeping on the floor," he said, his voice final. He pulled the thin, rough blanket from the bed and tossed it to her. "It's all yours." He proceeded to check the window lock and then sat in the room's single rickety chair, leaning it back against the wall. He crossed his arms over his chest, closed his eyes, and within minutes seemed to be asleep. But Seraphina knew it was a soldier's sleep, light and watchful. She lay in the bed, fully clothed, her heart aching with a strange mixture of gratitude and profound loneliness. This man was her husband, in name, and he was a complete, impenetrable fortress. On the second day, the landscape began to change, the gentle rolling hills of the south giving way to wilder, more dramatic fells. The air felt cleaner, colder. They started to talk. It began as a necessity, simple exchanges at inns. But it slowly deepened. He asked her, his voice rough with suspicion, "What does a lady know of books?" She found herself, to her own surprise, explaining, "I know that Newton's laws of motion govern the path of a cannonball just as they govern the orbit of a planet. I know that the tides, which you must know well in Scotland, are pulled by the moon." He listened. He didn't mock her. He watched her with that same unsettling intensity. "You're a blue-stocking," he stated. "I am a person who thinks," she retorted, stung. "Is that so wrong?" "It's different," he said, after a long pause. "Where I come from, knowledge is practical. How to read the weather, how to set a bone, how to know when the sea is angry." "That is also knowledge," she said softly. "I would like to know those things." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, so fleeting she thought she'd imagined it. "Perhaps I'll teach you, Mrs. MacLeod." The Mrs. MacLeod was a practical reminder, but it sent a strange shiver through her. On the third morning, they reached the border. Gretna Green was not a romantic village. It was a chaotic, muddy crossroads, catering to desperate runaways. The church was the blacksmith's forge, a noisy, soot-stained building reeking of hot iron and livestock. The blacksmith himself, a giant of a man named Robert Paisley, served as the anvil priest. He eyed them with a practiced, weary eye. "Another pair of runaways, eh?" he boomed. "You look a bit long in the tooth for it, soldier. And she looks terrified. You sure about this, lass?" "We are," Seraphina said, surprised at the strength in her own voice. She looked at Ewan. This was the moment of no return. He simply nodded, placing the required fee on the anvil. Mr. Paisley shrugged. "Aye, well, it's your funeral, or your life, as it may be." The ceremony was brief, chaotic, and profoundly unromantic. Paisley's wife and a local stable boy were called in as witnesses. They stood before the massive anvil, the symbol of unbreakable bonds. "Do you, Ewan, take this woman, Sarah, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Ewan said. His voice was steady, a low rumble in the noisy forge. "Do you, Sarah, take this man, Ewan, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Seraphina hesitated. This was real. This was binding. She was tying her life, her very identity, to this grim, silent stranger. She looked at his hand resting on the anvil, a large, calloused, capable hand, a hand that had saved her. "I do," she whispered. "Then by the laws of Scotland and the authority of this forge, I pronounce you man and wife. Sign the book." They scratched their names, Ewan MacLeod and Sarah Price, in the heavy, grease-stained ledger. It was done. It was anticlimactic and legally ironclad. They stepped back out into the grey afternoon. They were, in the eyes of the law, one person. "Well," Seraphina said, pulling her cloak tight. "Mr. MacLeod." "Mrs. MacLeod," he replied. His expression was unchanged. But something had changed. As they boarded the next coach, the one that would take them deep into Scotland, he did not head for the roof. He paid extra for 2 inside seats. "The rain is worse in the north," he said, by way of explanation, as he settled his large frame beside her. As the coach rattled on, Seraphina, exhausted beyond measure, felt her head begin to nod. She fought it, but the lack of sleep and the bone-jarring motion were too much. Her head lolled, finally coming to rest on Ewan MacLeod's broad, solid shoulder. She expected him to push her away, to stiffen. He did not. He sat as still as stone, a bulwark against the lurching of the coach. And for the first time in her life, surrounded by strangers, legally bound to a man she barely knew, Lady Seraphina Cavendish fell into a deep, dreamless, and profoundly safe sleep. They left the stagecoach at a small, wind-battered village in Ayrshire, on the west coast of Scotland. The sea was a vast expanse of churning grey, visible from the village high street. The air was so clean and sharp with salt, it almost hurt to breathe after the fug of London. "This is it," Ewan said. "My home is a few miles from here. We'll have to walk." He shouldered his own roll and, without asking, took her heavier satchel. The walk was arduous. They left the village and followed a muddy track that wound up into the hills, high above the coastline. The scenery was breathtakingly wild. There were no manicured parks here, only rolling hills covered in heather and gorse, dotted with hardy black-faced sheep. Seraphina's thin city shoes were quickly soaked. Her legs ached, and the wind whipped her hair from her bonnet. But she did not complain. She was too busy breathing. It felt like the first real breath of her life. Finally, over a rise, she saw it. Tucked into a small, sheltered dip in the land, overlooking the sea, was a cottage. It was small, very small. It was built of rough, grey stone, with a thick, thatched roof, and a single chimney puffing out a welcoming plume of peat smoke. A small patch of land behind it was fenced off for a garden. This then was the croft he had spoken of. This was the home of a poor, disbanded soldier. Seraphina's heart, which had been expecting. She didn't know what she had been expecting, but not this. Sank. This was not poverty, as she understood it, a lack of luxuries. This was a different, more fundamental kind of existence. Ewan must have seen the look on her face. His own, which had seemed to lighten as they walked, closed up again. "It's not Mayfair, my lady," he said, his voice flat. "But it's dry, and it's solid. It's perfect," she said, forcing a brightness she didn't feel. "It's clean." He gave her a skeptical look and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was one single room. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, a black kettle steaming over a low fire. A sturdy wooden table, 2 chairs, and a trunk sat in the middle. Against the far wall was a box bed, built into the wood, piled high with thick wool blankets. The floor was stone. It was impeccably clean and smelled of smoke, salt, and dried herbs. "A neighbor has been keeping the fire," Ewan said, dropping the bags. "This is it." Seraphina stood in the center of the room, her fine wool dress feeling absurdly out of place. This was her new life. This was what she had chosen. She had fled a gilded cage, only to find herself in a stone box. But then Ewan went to the hearth. He moved with a quiet, domestic familiarity. He stoked the fire, added more peat, and hung the kettle more securely. "The nights are cold," he said. "The fire is life here." He turned to her. "The bed is yours, as before. I'll take my blanket by the hearth." "No," Seraphina said, surprising herself. "We cannot. Not if this is our home. We are husband and wife. It is a large bed. We can share it." He looked at her, his grey eyes unreadable. "You are sure?" "It is practical," she said, blushing fiercely. "Like you said. The nights are cold." He gave a single, sharp nod. "Aye, they are." And so began their strange, new life. The first few days were a trial. Seraphina, who had been raised by nurses and maids, knew nothing of a practical nature. She tried to make bread and produced a charred, doughy brick. She tried to sweep the floor and sent ashes flying everywhere. She tried to milk the single, cantankerous goat tethered outside and ended up with an empty pail and a bruised shin. Ewan was endlessly, grimly patient. He never laughed at her. He would simply take the broom or the pail and say, "Watch, like this." He taught her. He showed her how to knead the dough, how to bank the fire, how to mend a fishing net, how to identify the edible mushrooms that grew on the hillside. He was a man of profound, practical competence. She, in turn, newfound knowledge. In the evenings, by the light of a single tallow candle, she would read to him from the one book she had brought in her satchel, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. He would sit, sharpening his knife or mending a boot, and just listen. "I can read," he said one night, almost defensively, when she paused. "I know," she said. "But do you like it?" "The words are good," he admitted, his face in shadow. "They paint a fine picture." They lived in this close, enforced intimacy. They shared the single bed, sleeping back to back, a yard of cold air between them, yet acutely aware of every breath the other took. They worked together, ate together, and in the quiet of the evenings, they talked. She told him about the stars, about her distant, cold father, about her fear of Belcourt. He told her less. He spoke of the land, of the sea, of the campaigns in France, but never of his family, never of his past. He was Ewan MacLeod, the soldier. That was all. And Seraphina found, to her astonishment, that she was happy. Genuinely, achingly happy. Her hands were raw, her back hurt, and her fine dresses were ruined. But she was useful. She was capable. And the man she shared this tiny cottage with was the most honourable, kind, and steadfast man she had ever known. The line between them, the in-name-only bargain, began to blur. A touch of hands as they passed a bowl of stew. A shared laugh when the goat ate her bonnet. A look, held a second too long, over the glow of the peat fire. One evening, a storm rolled in from the sea, a furious, shrieking thing that rattled the door and sent draughts of icy air through the stones. The cottage felt like a small, safe ship in a raging ocean. They sat at the table, the sound of the wind so loud they had to raise their voices. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "No," she said, looking at him. "Not when I am here. With you." The air between them changed, becoming as charged as the storm outside. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the grim soldier's mask fall away completely. She saw hunger and loneliness and a deep, aching tenderness. He stood, and she stood with him. He didn't cross the space between them. He waited. It was her choice. Seraphina took the 2 steps that separated them. She put her chapped, rough hands on his chest. He was so tall, she had to crane her neck to look at him. This was a bargain, Ewan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was," he agreed, his voice rough. I think I want to change the terms." He slowly raised his large, cool heat. He touched her face, his calloused thumb, tracing her cheekbone, as if she were made of priceless porcelain. "Seraphina," he breathed her name, like a prayer. "You don't know what you are doing." "I know exactly what I am doing," she replied. "I am with my husband." He bent his head and kissed her. It was not the chaste, polite kiss of a London ballroom. It was a kiss of salt and peat smoke and a desperate, long-banked fire finally breaking free. It was a kiss of truth, a kiss of homecoming. And in that moment, the bargain was sealed, not with words or anvils, but with a raw, undeniable love. The lie of their marriage had, somehow, become the only truth that mattered. Their domestic idol, forged in hardship and sealed by the storm, lasted for 6 blissful, simple weeks. Seraphina's hands healed into capable working hands. She learned the rhythms of the coast, the tides, the moods of the sky. Ewan, in turn, seemed to shed his grimness. He laughed, real deep laughs that crinkled the corners of his grey eyes. He was Ewan, the crofter, and she was Seraphina, his wife. The past was a distant, foggy dream. Then, one bright, cold afternoon, the dream shattered. Seraphina was outside, feeding scraps to the goat, when she heard it. The rumble of heavy carriage wheels on the track, a sound utterly alien to this landscape. She looked up. A magnificent, lacquered black carriage, bearing a coat of arms she didn't recognize, was pulling to a halt on the track above their cottage. It was drawn by 4 perfectly matched grey horses. Ewan came out of the cottage, a fishing net in his hands. He froze, his face hardening instantly, the soldier slamming back into place. The carriage door opened. Out stepped a man, his fine silk suit and powdered wig looking obscene against the wild heather. It was Lord Belcourt. Seraphina's blood ran cold. She felt the air leave her lungs. "My goodness," Belcourt called, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. He picked his way delicately down the path, his cane sinking into the mud. "Lady Seraphina, I must say, marriage agrees with you. You look wonderfully rustic. Is this your palace?" "What are you doing here?" Seraphina demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. She moved to stand beside Ewan. "I am here to collect my property," Belcourt said, his smile turning venomous. You have caused me a great deal of trouble and expense. Your father, a weak-willed fool, was no help. But I have resources. It took time, but we tracked your little elopement to Gretna. Sarah Price. How very common. Ewan stepped in front of her. He was no longer a crofter. He was a sentinel. She is my wife. You will leave this place. Belcourt laughed, a high-pitched, unpleasant sound. Your wife? You, a half-starved Highland savage? A penniless grunt? He drew a pistol from his coat. This marriage is a farce. Your father has already signed the annulment papers. A marriage under duress to a common vagrant. It will not stand. She is my betrothed. She is going nowhere, Ewan said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I think she is, Belcourt sneered. I have 2 outriders with this carriage, and I have a warrant for your arrest, MacLeod, for abduction. He gestured with the pistol. Now, Seraphina, come here. Be a good girl, and I won't have my men kill this animal. No, Seraphina cried. I am giving you one final chance, Ewan said, his voice deathly quiet. Get in your carriage, leave Scotland, and never return. Or what? Belcourt mocked. You'll challenge me? A duke's son? I'll have you flogged at the cart's tail. At that precise moment, another sound filled the air. Not a carriage, but the heavy, rhythmic thundering of many horses coming fast. Over the crest of the hill, a dozen riders appeared. They were not ruffians. They were uniformed men-at-arms, wearing a striking green and silver livery. They rode with military precision, and at their head was a stern-looking older man in fine but practical gentleman's attire. They surrounded the cottage and the magnificent carriage in a silent, professional crescent. Belcourt's jaw dropped. What is this? The older man dismounted, his boots landing softly on the turf. He walked past Lord Belcourt as if he were a piece of furniture, and stopped 3 paces from Ewan. He bowed, a deep, respectful bow from the waist. Your Grace, the man said, his voice clear and deferential. We have been awaiting your signal. The sea serpent made landfall at midnight. We apprehended the men. As you suspected, the cargo was French brandy and arms. Seraphina's world tilted on its axis. Your Grace? Belcourt, who had frozen in mid-sneer, now looked utterly baffled. Your Grace, what is this nonsense? Finlay, is that you? What is the meaning of this? The man, Finlay, turned to Belcourt. Lord Belcourt, you are on the private land of His Grace, the Duke of Ardrossan, and you are pointing a pistol at him. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the cry of a gull and the panicked breathing of Lord Belcourt. Belcourt's face, which had been puce with rage, drained to a waxy, putty-coloured white. His pistol hand trembled. Duke of Ardrossan. He stared at Ewan, at the poor soldier in his rough homespun clothes and muddy boots. Ewan MacLeod, no, the Duke of Ardrossan, slowly reached out, and, with 2 fingers, took the pistol from Belcourt's unresisting hand. Evelyn St. Clair, Ewan said, his voice holding the cold, crisp authority of 1,000 years of command. At your service. He turned to his man. Mr. Finlay, it seems Lord Belcourt was also involved in our little smuggling enterprise. We found correspondence on the ship's captain, did we not? We did, Your Grace, Finlay said, his face grim. Directly implicating him. Treason, then, as well as smuggling, Evelyn, Ewan, mused, and threatening the Duchess, a very busy afternoon. Duchess, Belcourt squeaked, his eyes darting wildly to Seraphina. Take him, Evelyn commanded. Hold him at the castle. We will await the king's magistrate. 2 of the uniformed men grabbed Belcourt, who offered no resistance. He was a broken, terrified man. This is a mistake. A misunderstanding. His protests were cut off as he was dragged away and bundled unceremoniously into his own fine carriage. Evelyn watched them go, his face impassive. The trap he had been setting for months, living as Ewan MacLeod to root out the smugglers threatening his coastline, had sprung, and his oldest enemy had walked right into it. Mr. Finlay bowed again. "Your Grace, shall we escort you and Her Grace back to Dunscaregg Castle? It has been prepared for your arrival." "Thank you, Finlay. Have the carriage sent for." "We will follow shortly," Evelyn said. Finlay nodded, mounted, and with a signal, the riders vanished as quickly as they had come, taking the carriage and the sputtering Lord Belcourt with them. Silence descended once more on the small cottage. Seraphina began, her voice a reedy whisper. She couldn't say his name. He turned to her. The Duke was gone. The soldier was gone. In his place was a stranger, his grey eyes filled with a desperate, pleading agony. "Seraphina," he said. She stared at him. The man she had loved, the man she had scrubbed floors with, the man who had patiently taught her to make bread, the man she had given herself to in that small, humble bed. It was all a lie, a game, a test. He was the wealthiest, most powerful peer in all of Scotland. He owned everything as far as she could see, the hills, the sea, the village, and he had let her believe he was a poor crofter. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel joy. She felt a betrayal so vast and so cold it eclipsed everything else. It was Lord Belcourt all over again, just in a different package. Another powerful man, manipulating her with lies. "You lied to me," she whispered, the words ripped from her throat. "Seraphina, let me explain," he started, taking a step toward her. She flinched, striking his hand away as if he were a serpent. "Don't touch me," she screamed, the sound echoing in the vast, open air. "You lied!" She turned from him, from the man she loved, and ran. Not to the path, not to the magnificent castle that was apparently her new home. She ran into the cottage, the only place that had ever felt real, and slammed the heavy wooden door, dropping the bar. She was trapped again. But this time, the man on the other side was her husband. He stood outside the door for a long time. The silence from within the cottage was more damning than her screams. He heard no weeping, just a profound, echoing void. The woman he loved, the woman he had finally allowed himself to love, was locked inside, and he was the one who had imprisoned her. "Seraphina," he called, his voice resting against the thick wood. "Please, let me. I never meant to hurt you." No reply. The Ewan MacLeod persona. It wasn't a lie. Not at first. He leaned his forehead against the door, the rough grain of the wood pressing into his skin. "I am. I was a soldier. I served under that name, my family, my title. It has been a weight my entire life. People only see the Duke. They see the land, the money. They never see me." He waited. Nothing. When I came back from the continent, I found this rot on my own lands. Smugglers. Traitors. Finlay suspected Belcourt, but we had no proof. I couldn't investigate as the Duke. Everyone is watching the Duke. So I became Ewan again, the disbanded soldier. No one looks twice at him. I lived here, in this cottage, for 2 months before I ever met you. This is more real to me than the castle. He heard a shift inside. She was listening. And then you stumbled into that alley. You were so terrified, so strong. You didn't want a title. You wanted freedom. You wanted anything but a man like me. A man like the Duke of Ardrossan. His voice grew thick. And when you proposed that bargain, to marry me, the poor soldier. God help me, Seraphina. It was the first honest thing anyone had ever offered me. I needed to see if it was real, to see if you were real. So you tested me. Her voice was muffled, thick with fury and unshed tears. You let me grub in the dirt. You watched me blister my hands and make a fool of myself, all for your aristocratic amusement. A little game to see if the lady could handle it. No, he roared, slamming his fist against the door, making it rattle. It was never a game. It was my life. It was the only way I knew how to be me. I was testing myself, to see if Ewan was a man worthy of a woman like you. And I fell in love with you, not the Duke. Me, Ewan, the man in this cottage, the man who loves that you read Shakespeare and argue about the stars, the man who is terrified right now that he has lost the only thing that has ever mattered. The bar inside the cottage scraped back. The door creaked open. Seraphina stood there. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed but blazing. She was no longer the frightened girl from London. She was not the Duchess of Ardrossan. She was the woman who had survived the journey, the woman who had learned to command the fire and the sea. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice quiet but deadly. "Are you the Duke, playing at being a commoner? Or are you a commoner, playing at being a Duke?" He stepped over the threshold. The tiny room suddenly felt charged, a stage for this final confrontation. "I am both," he said, his voice raw with sincerity. "And I was a fool to think I could keep them separate. The Duke has the power to protect you from men like Belcourt. The Duke has a duty to his people, to root out the smugglers who poison his shores. But it is Ewan who knows how to mend a net. It is Ewan who loves the smell of peat smoke. And it is Ewan who loves you. More than his title, more than his land, more than his own life." He did not try to touch her. He just stood there, his soul bared, his fate in her blistered, capable hands. She searched his face, looking past the ducal authority and the soldier's hardness, searching for the man she had married, the man who had listened to her, who had respected her mind, who had slept by her side in chaste silence, and who had finally, tenderly, claimed her as his wife. She saw him. He was still there, trapped behind the grey, frightened eyes of the Duke of Ardrossan. He wasn't a liar, she realized. He was just a man, as trapped by his gilded cage as she had been by hers. "Well," she said, her voice still shaking, but a spark of the old defiant Seraphina returning. "I married Ewan MacLeod, a poor soldier, and he owes me a new pair of shoes. These are ruined." Relief hit him so hard he almost staggered. Yes, shoes. I can get you shoes. 1,000 pairs. Whatever you want." "I don't want 1,000 pairs," she said, stepping toward him. "I just want one pair, a sturdy pair, the kind a crofter's wife would wear." She put her hands on his chest, right where she had that night in the storm. "But I suppose I should see this castle. Dunscareg, was it?" "Aye," he whispered, his hands coming up to cover hers. "Dunscareg Castle. Is it very cold?" she asked. "It's vast," he admitted, "and built of stone. It's been empty for a long time." "Then you'll have to light the fires, Your Grace," she said, a small, tentative smile touching her lips. "I am the Duchess, after all, and I find I am very, very good at making a cold house a home." He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since London. He pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of wood smoke and her. He was Evelyn St. Clair, the Duke of Ardrossan, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. And he was Ewan MacLeod, a simple man, home from the wars. And finally, thanks to the impossible, brilliant woman in his arms, he was whole. The story of Seraphina and Evelyn, or Ewan, was just beginning. Theirs was a marriage that started as a lie, was forged in hardship, and was finally sealed not by a title but by a truth. They proved that true love isn't found in a ballroom, but in a shared life, whether in a tiny cottage or a grand castle. If you were captivated by Seraphina's journey from a trapped lady to a powerful duchess, and by the duke who had to become a poor soldier to find his heart, then please, let us know. This story took a lot of love to bring to life, and if you enjoyed it, please support our channel. Hit that like button so we know to make more dramas like this one. Share this video with a friend who loves a story of passion and secrets. And most importantly, click subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another epic romance. Thank you for listening.